Would I rather be feared or loved? Both. I want people to be afraid of how much they love me. This is one of many quotes by Michael Scott. This type of humor can be found littered throughout The Office. The Office is one of the greatest shows of all time, but specifically, it is better than Parks and Recreation, which is a very similar show. Many people say the two shows are so similar that you can hardly tell the difference between them. But I would say there are three big differences between them. First, of course, is comedy. Second being characters, and third being plot. The comedy, of course, is the first thing we need to consider when deciding the difference between the two shows, because they are both comedy shows. I have seen the entirety of both of these shows, and I can tell you for certain that I laughed more times and more heartily when watching The Office than when watching Parks and Rec. The reason for this is because of the humor within The Office. The Office operates mostly on a specific type of humor, which is cringe humor, or cringe humor is the type of comedy in which something is just so embarrassing you cannot help but laugh at it. The Office does this very well. Parks and Rec tries to do the same thing, but does not achieve it quite to the extent that The Office does. A perfect example of this is when Michael Scott promises an entire class of kindergartners that he will pay for their tuition if they graduate high school. Turns out when it comes to graduating high school, he never had the funds to pay for any of their tuition in the first place, and was put in a very, very awkward situation, which was quite comedic. His but both shows, of course, had very funny ideas, just in the same way, but none of them were quite as extreme as that example. When you're talking about Parks and Rec, Parks and Rec was just less extreme and less interesting than the extremes hit within The Office. The next thing to consider would be the characters within both shows. So comparing the most funny characters according to Cinema Blend, we compare Michael Scott and Ron Swanson. Michael Scott is incredibly stupid, and it's consistently funny throughout the entire show. And Ron Swanson is funny in a different way. He is just extreme on his views of killing and of being alpha. It's not quite as funny as when Michael Scott says, for example, "I'm not superstitious, but I am a little stitious." That's just a prime example of when Michael shows his stupidity. But Ron Swanson's quote is not quite as interesting when he says, "Fishing relaxes me. It's like yoga, except I get to kill something." Of course, killing and stupidity are two different things, and stupidity is inherently more funny than death. So that right there is just one clear difference between The Office and Parks and Rec. Another thing about the characters is the characters in The Office are just outlandish. They're crazy. They're weird. You would never expect to meet one of the characters from The Office in real life. They're just so out there. An example of this would be Dwight Schrute. Dwight Schrute is very, very, very literal and very kind of like strict and just a little uptight. But and when I say a little, I mean a lot. But the people comparatively in Parks and Rec are just normal people almost. That maybe slightly exaggerated, but normal people that you could expect to see, and they're just too realistic for a comedy situation. Another thing about the characters is The Office doesn't have any side characters. Parks and Rec does have side characters. The Office does a really good job of making sure every character is important to not only the comedy, but the plot. For example, Creed Bratton. Creed Bratton is a great example. He has some of the least screen time in the entire show, and yet he still manages to come with things such as the time when he when he says he transfers all his debt to William Charles Schneider while holding up a passport with that name and his picture. He also contributes to the plot when we find that he has been a wanted criminal the entire show. This leads into the next point, of course, the plot or the story. The stories of the show are quite interesting. So many people say that they have no story, but the story of The Office is just the quirky interactions between a crazy boss and his odd employees. And there are many subplots to this story, of course. For example, Jim and Pam's relationship, that's an ongoing struggle, and Michael's relationships, which are a disaster almost all the time, and even smaller subplots such as Kelly and Ryan's relationships, and the fact that Oscar is hiding being gay, and it's just an intricate plot line. The plot line in Parks and Rec attempts to do similar things when but it has a main plot line that is ultimately unsatisfying when they try to fill in the pit and make a park out of it. It's just, it seems to go nowhere, and in the end, you don't like it. Of course, there are still subplots, but they're not as interesting, and they're less memorable. All in all, Parks and Rec is just less memorable. It tries to do exactly the same things as The Office, but you just don't remember them. They're not as interesting. They don't make you laugh. So I would encourage you to watch both shows and decide for yourself. But in my heart, The Office will always be the best.